All right, so we're going to spend probably maybe 3 class periods going over chapter 5, possibly 2. Tomorrow we might be able to conclude that. We do have a section of notes with the Zinger trial that's of utmost importance for the remaining part of this chapter. So it may be Friday when we conclude the notes. But anyway, we do want to go ahead and get started with this particular chapter. What we're talking about here is colonial society. There is the mentionings of the First Great Awakening that you are going to be, or you're going to need to know about, as well as far as some relations that's beginning to deteriorate with the British in this chapter. But a lot of the first part of these notes are nothing more than specifics as far as, the society in general. Here is a little information. By 1775, Great Britain ruled 32 colonies in North America. 13 of them revolted. The ones in what's today the United States, of course. Canada, Jamaica were wealthier than the original 13. All of them were growing by leaps and bounds. 1775, the population numbered 2.5 million people. Average age was 16 years old, due mainly to having several children. Most of the population, 95%, was densely cooped up east of the Alleghenies, though by 1775, some had slowly trickled into Tennessee and Kentucky. Okay, so here we go. Population was growing dramatically. Between 1700 and 1775, population would double every 25 years. All right, so some factors involved as far as the population growth. Birth rates, there again, the quotation rattlesnakes as far as the quickness, as far as multiplication, what have you. Sometimes we say they multiply like rabbits, other times we say they multiply like rattlesnakes. Go figure. All right, diets, birth rates, climate, immigration, and youthful population. There again, as we've already mentioned, due mainly to having several children. Okay, change in the ratio of English to American colonists that you see here. All right, so these are just, there again, your colonial demographics. This is a chart here as far as showing the population of male and female. All right, the population location, as we've already said, most of the population there again was between the Atlantic and the Appalachian Mountains. Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina were Maryland, the 5 biggest colonies. Philadelphia, the biggest city. Of course, this would eventually become the political hub. Virginia, of course, at this time, at chapter 5, was operating a tobacco monopoly. They were very successful. So your Virginia, your Maryland was, at the climax as far as tobacco was concerned. In the Northeast, colonial shipbuilding was very advanced at this time. And a lot of that was due in part to the protection from the British military. So they're going to get really good with that. All right, the colonial America as a melting pot by 1775. English, of course, is 49%. So therefore, it's safe to say that colonial America was mostly English, but however, there was other ethnicities as well. Germans accounted for about 6%. I don't know if you could see that or not, but Germans or Pennsylvania Dutch in green below English is 6 to 7%, which would be equivalent to of about 150,000 people by 1775. So that's what that says. That's kind of hard to see. Most were Protestant, primarily Lutheran, and were called the Pennsylvania Dutch. a corruption of Deutsch, which means German. Most would move to backcountry work industriously, clung to German heritage and language. The Scotch-Irish was 7%. Therefore would be equivalent to about 175,000 people. Over many decades, they had been transplanted to Northern Ireland, but they had not found a home there. The already existing Irish Catholics resented the intruders. Many of the Scotch-Irish reached America, became squatters, quarreling with both Indian and white landowner. They seemed to try to move as far from Britain as possible, trickling down to Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, which I would say a good portion of Carolinians have the Scotch-Irish descent. I know Stuart is very Scotch-oriented. Henceforth the third point under Scotch-Irish, the fierce tempers, temperamental people, angry people. Stuarts are very angry people. Kelsey is part Stuart. Ask her, or agitated people. Anyway, 1764, the Scotch-Irish led the armed march of the Paxton Boys that you see at the bottom. The Paxtons led a march on Philadelphia to protest the Quaker peaceful treatment of the Indians. They later started the North Carolina Regulator Movement in the hills and mountains of the colony, aimed against domination by Eastern powers in the colony. Very hot-headed, very independent-minded. Okay, so when you think of that, think of Kelsey Waldrop. Very hot-headed, very independent-minded, because she, there again, like myself, is part Stuart. But anyway, we won't beat up on her anymore. All right, so the colonial America was a melting pot by 1775. In the South, there were 20% as far as African slaves. 90% of the African or what population was in slavery. The other European descent of 5%, which would be the Huguenots, mainly out west. We've not studied New France yet, but I think the next chapter is talking about New France. So there is going to be a French persuasion west of the Appalachian Mountains, and those French Huguenots would reside there. Welsh, Dutch, Swedes, Jews, Irish, Swiss, Scots, Highlanders, all have something in common, in that they show little loyalty to the crown. So Americans were of all races and mixed blood, so it was no wonder that other races from other countries had a hard time being able to classify them, especially in the essays of Crevecoeur. And this leads us to with the what was an American. Now, Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, there again he changed his name several times, is a widely regarded example of American literature. He wrote 12 essays and were highly influential texts that includes elements of both fiction and nonfiction. First letter is a modest response. There again, in this, he is referring to the group of people here who are coming to the New World for prosperity. So there again, they all have something similar as far as, coming to America. The character that he observes is simple, humble, honest, and generous, and the product of Americans' ability to work in peace and freedom for the benefit of themselves, family, communities, rather than for the ruling classes of Europe. So this sort of was an element of differentiation compared to Old World versus New. And a lot of that is wrote in his first letter. He makes mention in other letters as far as, slavery, and how that, one particular, I think it's letter 9, and how he died horribly in a cage. And so, yeah, there again, he is just writing based on his experiences, in the New World. Everybody was here and wanted to prosper. And one of the assignments today, or for this week, is reading some of that excerpt and I think answering 2 critical thinking questions. And by the way, make sure you do that in elaborate detail. Don't give me just 1 or 2 sentences with that. There's only 2 questions with that. The final letter that he writes returns to the more somber, skeptical tones. James discusses the encroaching American Revolutionary War. He mentions that in his writings, the torn between loyalties to the nation of his birth, Britain, and his new home. He condemns the violence and chaos of war and decides to flee from both sides to live among a group of Native Americans. So there again, sometimes he takes, fiction and nonfiction and creates characters and things like that. But the summary-wise, the overview, it's just his personal stance and what he sees in American society. The structure of colonial society, in contrast to contemporary Europe, America was a land of opportunity. Anyone who was willing to work hard could possibly go from rags to riches, and poverty was scorned. Class differences did emerge as a small group of aristocrats made up of the rich farmers, merchants, officials, clergymen had much of the power. Armed conflicts in the 1690s and 1700s enriched a number of merchants in New England and middle colonies. War also created many widows and orphans who eventually had to turn to charity. In the South, a firm social pyramid emerged containing the immensely rich plantation owner had many slaves. The yeoman farmer or small farmer, they owned their land. Maybe a few landless whites who owned no land and either worked for a landowner or rented land to farm. And that's why you don't see a lot of huge white population in the South, because there is a competition between the poor white and, of course, the African slave. So a lot of your poor whites so chose not to reside in the South because they're again of that work competition. Indentured servants of America were the paupers and the criminals sent to the New World. Some of them were actually unfortunate victims of Britain's unfair laws and did become respectable citizens. The group was dwindling, though, by the 1700s, thanks, of course, to Bacon's Rebellion. All right, so that there again is just the structure of colonial society. Here's some more information. By 1776, of course, there is a social stratification beginning to set in. All right, merchants enriched by war contracts, imported clothing, seating in churches and schools according to social rank. It's raised some barriers to upward mobility and fears that America was becoming Europeanized. All right, most of your professionals were deemed as either clergy, most respected, of course, from a religious perspective. We're still following in suit with the Puritan and Pilgrim ideas. They still have tremendous roots. So, of course, your clergy is going to be, heavily respected there. The most honored profession in the colonial times, the priest, which in 1775 had less power than before during the height of the Bible Commonwealth, but still wielded a great amount of authority. Physicians were not highly esteemed, and many of them were bad as medical practices were archaic. Bleeding was often a favorite and deadly solution to illnesses. Plagues were, of course, a nightmare. Smallpox afflicting 1 or 5 persons, including George Washington. It was rampant throughout a crude form of inoculation, for it was introduced in 1721. Some of the clergy and doctors didn't like the inoculation, though, preferring not to tamper with the will of God. At first, lawyers weren't liked, being regarded as noisy scumbags. Criminals often represented themselves in court. By 1750, lawyers were recognized as useful, and many defended high-profile cases were great orators and played important roles in the history of America. One in particular, John Adams, as he defends the British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. This, by the way, here is the first political cartoon. I think we get into that more in preceding chapters. Anyway, Workday America. Agriculture was the leading industry by a huge margin since farmers could seem to grow anything. Maryland, Virginia, tobacco was the staple crop, and by 1759, New York was exporting 80,000 barrels of flour a year. Fishing could be rewarding, though not as much as farming, as it was pursued in all the American colonies, especially in the New England area. Trading was also popular and prevalent industry as commerce occurred all around the colonies, especially with the triangular trade route. A ship, for example, would leave New England with rum and go to the Gold Coast of Africa, trade for slaves, and then it would go to the West Indies and exchange the slaves for molasses, for rum, which it would sell to New England once it returned there. And so that there again is the working content of the triangular trade route. Manufacturing was not as important, though many small enterprises did exist. Strong-backed laborers and skilled craftspeople were scarce and highly prized. Manufacturing was limited and only a secondary importance. Why? All right, this is very important that you're able to see what's taking place here. There's not a lot of manufacturing going on in the Atlantic coast here, or what we would associate as the 13 colonies. And the reason why is mercantilism, all right? What we mean by that is this, all right? The raw material is going to be taken from this area. The raw material would be shipped back to the motherland, of course, which is Britain, and then they would manufacture based off the raw material. So under the mercantilistic theory that England had as far as the colonies, they were the only extractors of the raw material. They couldn't extract the raw material and produce here. They had to send the raw material to England, all right, and then they would produce the finished product and then force the colonies to buy it back. They always have a buyer. They always have money in their pocket. This is what we call a favorable balance of trade. So England says we're good. You know, we always have a favorable balance because we can force these colonies here to buy back the finished product. Okay, so manufacturing was limited. You need to know that, okay? You definitely need to know that mercantilism was limiting the manufacturing ability in the colonies. And, you know, there again, all of this are reasons. These, finding farmland, lack of money to invest, lack of good laborers, and partly due to mercantilism, all right? So make sure, there again, that you know those, all right? They're gonna keep a tight thumb on these colonies as far as mercantilism. All right, lumbering was the most important manufacturing activity. And of course, British was hungry for the American timber because there again, that timber can be sent over to England, and then there again, they can finish that product, whether that product be a piece of furniture or whether it be, you know, ships and so forth. Of course, there is your response, needing ships. Eventually, there, as we said before, America is going to become more competitive when it comes to shipbuilding. And there again, they're building a lot of the British ships over here, sending them back, so they're going to become very advanced as far as that's concerned. Britain sometimes would mark the tallest trees for its navy mast, and colonists resented that, even though there were countless other good trees in the area, and the marked tree was going toward a common defense. It was the principle of Britain first that was detested by the colonists, but that's sort of the way that they would do things. when it comes to the lumber and its association ships. All right, economic problems in the 1730s. What economic problems faced colonists here? Burgeoning American population desired greater quantity of British goods. There again, England saturated with American products. There again, this is the whole idea of mercantilism. The question is, how could colonists sell enough goods to make money to buy what they wanted in Britain? So what do they start doing? They start seeking foreign markets. They start looking at the French West Indies. They start looking in other areas, other countries to buy goods. But there again, under the idea of mercantilism, England's like, no, you're not going to do that. Because if you do that, then we're going to put a tariff on you or a tax on you. And therefore, it would raise the product or the price of the product of the good bought in the other country. And then the colonists then would recognize, well, it's cheaper now because of the tariff to purchase it from Britain. So it's always an element of economic control with the economic problems here. Case in point, the Molasses Act of 1733. Parliament passes the Molasses Act, which, if successful, would have struck a crippling blow to American international trade by hindering its trade with the French West Indies. We don't want you trading with the French West Indies. We want you trading with us because we always want, there again, the export. We want the favorable balance of trade. Results of disagreement. Colonists got around the act, of course, through smuggling. The tax, there again, as it says here, going to make the French good more expensive than the British good, and so it kind of forces us to buy the British good because, of course, it's cheaper. Colonists in New England and middle colonies got around there again by smuggling. This is a growing unrest with Parliament. All right, this Molasses Act of 1733 really is the foundation of the series of taxes that are to come 30 years later. So this is really your beginning moment here of growing unrest when it comes to the ideas of taxes. Very important that you understand the Molasses Act of 1733. It lays that foundation between this and establishes this element of resent. Colonial transportation in the day, roads in 1700s America were extremely bad. Not until the 19th century did they even connect large cities. It took a young Benjamin Franklin 9 days to get from Boston to Philadelphia. Not only were they bad, they were extremely dangerous. People who would venture these roads would often sign wills and pray with family members before embarking. As a result, towns seem to cluster around slow, navigable water sources like gentle rivers or by the ocean. Taverns and bars sprang up to serve weary travelers and were great places of gossip and news. An intercolonial mail system was set up as well in the mid-1700s, but mailmen often passed time by reading private letters since there was really nothing much to do. This day in history, September 23rd. This is our stopping point here for the notes today. We will finish or get close to finishing Chapter 5 notes either tomorrow or Friday.